The bullet missed her face by an inch, and in that crystalline moment of suspended time, Grace Emmett made a choice that would silence her forever. She watched her father collapse in the dusty street of Del Rio, Texas, the blood pooling beneath him like spilled wine. And when the man with the scar across his throat demanded to know where her father had hidden the stolen gold, something inside her shattered completely. She opened her mouth to scream, to lie, to beg, but no sound emerged. The trauma seized her vocal cords like iron bands, and in the months that followed, doctors from San Antonio to El Paso would shake their heads and tell her what she already knew. Her voice was gone, locked away in some unreachable place where terror lived. That was in the spring of 1873, and now it was the summer of 1876. 3 years of silence that had transformed Grace from a chattering 17-year-old girl into a woman of 20 who communicated through careful gestures, and the small leather journal she kept tucked in her apron pocket. She worked at the Silver Bell Saloon, not as one of the painted ladies upstairs, but as the woman who kept the books, served the food, and maintained an island of order in the chaos of whiskey and gambling. The owner, a former Confederate colonel named Jeremiah Walsh, had taken pity on her after her father's murder, offering her room and board in exchange for honest work. He never pushed her to speak, never treated her silence as a burden, and for that she was grateful in ways she could never express. The summer heat pressed down on Del Rio like a heavy blanket, the kind of heat that made men irritable and quick to draw their pistols. The Rio Grande flowed sluggish and low, and the Mexican border town of Ciudad Acuña shimmered across the water like a mirage. Grace moved through the saloon's back room, counting bottles and marking numbers in her ledger with precise strokes of her pencil. The sounds of the saloon filtered through the thin walls. Raucous laughter, the tinny sound of the piano, the occasional crash of breaking glass. She had learned to read the rhythms of violence, to know when a disagreement over cards was about to turn deadly, and she would slip away before the shooting started. She was marking down a shipment of whiskey when she heard the front door bang open with unusual force. The piano stuttered to a stop, and the conversation died like someone had thrown a blanket over it. Grace set down her pencil and moved to the doorway, peering through the crack to see what had caused such a reaction. A man stood in the entrance, backlit by the harsh afternoon sun so that he appeared as a dark silhouette against the glare. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders, and the kind of lean build that came from hard work rather than deprivation. As he moved further into the room and her eyes adjusted, Grace could make out more details. Worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a gun belt sitting low on his hips. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even from this distance. They were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage after a rainstorm, and they swept the room with the careful assessment of a man who expected trouble. "I am looking for Jeremiah Walsh," the man said, and his voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. It was a deep voice, roughened by dust and distance, with the faint trace of an accent Grace could not quite place. Southern, but not Texas. Perhaps Tennessee or Kentucky. Colonel Walsh emerged from behind the bar, his hand resting casually near the pistol he kept on a shelf below the counter. "You found him. What is your business?" The stranger reached slowly into his vest pocket, making sure everyone could see his movements, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have a letter of introduction from Marcus Thornton in Austin. I am Harrison Xerxes. I was told you might have worked for a man with my particular skills." Grace saw Walsh relax slightly at the name. Marcus Thornton was a cattle baron who owned half of Central Texas, a man whose word carried weight. Walsh took the letter, unfolded it, and read quickly. His eyebrows rose slightly, and when he looked back at the stranger, Harrison Xerxes, his expression had shifted from suspicion to calculation. "Says here you are one of the best horse breakers in Texas," Walsh said. "Says you have a way with animals that borders on supernatural." A ghost of a smile touched Harrison's mouth. "I would not go that far, but I understand horses, and they seem to understand me. I heard you have a string of Mustangs that need breaking before the autumn cattle drive." 20 head of the wildest, meanest Mustangs you ever saw," Walsh confirmed. "Caught them up in the breaks north of here. Pure hell on 4 legs. I have had 3 men try to break them, and all 3 ended up injured or worse. You think you can handle them?" "I can handle them," Harrison said with quiet confidence. "But I do it my way. No harsh bits, no beating them into submission. I work with them, not against them." Some of the men in the saloon muttered at this. The idea of breaking horses without force was foreign to most of them, almost laughable, but Walsh nodded slowly. "Thornton said you were particular. All right, Xerxes. You can use my corrals and the barn out back, food and a place to sleep included. If you can get even half those horses ready for working cattle, I will pay you twice the going rate." "All 20 will be ready," Harrison said. He extended his hand, and Walsh shook it firmly. As the tension in the room dissipated and conversation resumed, Grace found herself still watching the stranger. There was something different about him, something in the careful way he moved and the quiet certainty in his voice. He was not like the other drifters who passed through Del Rio, all swagger and bravado. This man had a stillness to him, a sense of being completely at ease in his own skin. Walsh called her out from the back room with a gesture, and Grace emerged, smoothing her simple cotton dress and tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. Harrison's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw him take in her appearance. A woman of 20 with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, brown eyes that were too serious for her young face, a mouth that rarely smiled. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a quiet strength in her features that some men found appealing. "This is Grace Emmett," Walsh said. "She runs my books and keeps this place from falling apart. She will show you to the barn and get you settled." "Grace, this is Harrison Xerxes. He will be working with the Mustangs." Grace nodded and gestured toward the back door. Harrison touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and followed her through the saloon. She was acutely aware of his presence behind her as they stepped into the glaring heat of the back lot. The barn stood about 50 yards from the saloon, weathered wood that had once been painted red, but had faded to a dull rust color. Beyond it were the corrals, and even from this distance Grace could hear the wild Mustangs, the thunder of hooves, the sharp whistles and snorts of agitated horses. Harrison stopped to look at them, his eyes narrowing against the sun. "They are magnificent," he said softly, and Grace heard genuine admiration in his voice. She followed his gaze and saw what he saw. Powerful animals with coats of every color, from buckskin to paint to pure black. They moved together in the corral like a single organism, their eyes rolling white with fear and defiance. Grace pulled out her journal and pencil, writing quickly. "The room above the barn has a bed and a stove. Meals at the saloon 3 times daily. Water pumped by the back door." She held it out to him, and Harrison took it, reading carefully. His expression did not change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. When he handed the journal back, his fingers brushed hers briefly, and she felt calluses rough as tree bark. "You do not speak," he said, and it was a statement rather than a question. There was no pity in his voice, no awkward curiosity, just simple acknowledgement. Grace shook her head and wrote again. Not anymore. Harrison nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then I will have to learn to listen in other ways, he said. My grandmother was Cherokee. She taught me that words are just one form of communication, and often the least honest. Something in Grace's chest loosened slightly, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. She led him to the barn, showed him where the tack was stored, pointed out the ladder that led to the small room above. The space was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with a quilt, a small cast iron stove, a table and chair beneath the single window that looked out over the corrals. This will do fine, Harrison said. He set his saddle bags on the table and turned back to her. Thank you for your help, Miss Emmett. Grace nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. The horses out there, he said. They are scared. They have been caught, penned, probably beaten. They do not understand yet that not all men want to hurt them. It takes time to build trust when trust has been broken. He paused, and when she looked back at him, his gray-green eyes held her steadily. I imagine it is the same with people. Grace felt her breath catch. He was not talking about the horses anymore, or at least not only about the horses. She managed a small nod and fled back to the saloon, her heart beating faster than the simple encounter warranted. Over the next few days, Grace found herself acutely aware of Harrison's presence on the property. She would see him in the early mornings, before the saloon opened, standing in the corral with the mustangs. He did not try to catch them or corner them. He simply stood there, still as a fence post, letting them grow accustomed to his presence. Sometimes he would sit in the dust and wait, and gradually the horses' panic would subside. One morning Grace watched from the saloon window as a young paint mare approached him cautiously, stretching her neck to sniff at his outstretched hand. Harrison did not move, did not grab at her. He simply let her investigate, and when she backed away, he remained still. It was a kind of patience Grace had never witnessed before, a willingness to let things unfold in their own time. Most of the men she knew tried to force the world to bend to their will through strength or violence. Harrison seemed to understand that some things could not be forced, only invited. She brought him lunch that first week, a plate of beans and cornbread that she carried out to the corral fence. He was inside with a buckskin gelding, standing close enough to touch but not touching, just breathing in rhythm with the animal. When he saw her, he backed away slowly and climbed over the fence with easy grace. Thank you, he said, taking the plate. You did not have to bring it all the way out here. Grace pulled out her journal. You were working. Seemed a long walk back for you. He read it and smiled, a real smile that transformed his face from stern to unexpectedly warm. That is kind of you. He sat on the top rail of the fence to eat, and after a moment's hesitation, Grace sat on the rail beside him, leaving a respectable distance between them. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the horses. Then Harrison said, Do you ride? Grace nodded and wrote, Used to, not much anymore. You should ride again, he said. There is freedom in it, nothing else quite like it. He paused, chewing thoughtfully. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11, I got thrown from a horse. Broke my arm in 2 places. I was terrified to get back on, certain that every horse was going to kill me. My grandmother took me out to this old mare we had, gentlest creature you ever met. She did not tell me to mount up, did not force anything. She just had me sit with the horse, brush her, feed her apples. Every day for a month. By the end, I wanted to ride again. The fear was still there, but it did not control me anymore. Grace understood what he was really saying, the parallel he was drawing. She wrote, Some fears run deeper than broken bones. True enough, Harrison agreed. But the principle is the same. You do not fight fear head-on. You work around it, get to know it, learn that you are bigger than it. He looked at her directly. If you do not mind me asking, how long has it been since you spoke? Grace hesitated, then wrote, 3 years, since my father died. I am sorry, Harrison said, and the simple words carried genuine feeling. Was it illness, murdered? She wrote the word quickly and closed the journal before he could ask more questions. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. I am sorry, he said again. That is a hard thing to carry. Grace nodded, surprised to find her eyes stinging. Most people either avoided the subject entirely or pressed for details she did not want to give. Harrison did neither. He simply acknowledged her loss and let it be. My own father died when I was 16, Harrison said, looking out at the horizon. He was a farrier, and a horse he was shoeing kicked him in the head, gone before he hit the ground. For a long time I was angry. Angry at the horse, angry at my father for not being more careful, angry at God for letting it happen. But anger is just fear in different clothes, I think. I was scared of being alone, of having to make my way in the world without his guidance. He finished the last of the cornbread and set the plate aside. Eventually, I realized he had already taught me everything I needed. I was carrying him with me all along. Grace felt something shift inside her, like a door opening just a crack. She wrote, What would he think of what you do now? Harrison smiled. I think he would say I am too soft on the horses, but I also think he would be proud. He taught me to respect animals, to see them as partners rather than tools. I just took that lesson further than he did. The bell for the lunch service rang from the saloon, and Grace slid off the fence rail. She took the empty plate and turned to go, but Harrison's voice stopped her. Miss Emmett, he said, I am glad you brought me lunch. I hope you will do it again. She looked back at him and found herself nodding. She did hope she would do it again, too. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Grace would bring Harrison his midday meal, and they would sit together on the corral fence, communicating through her written words and his spoken ones. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his Cherokee grandmother who had survived the Trail of Tears, and taught him to read the land and understand animals. He spoke about the years he had spent drifting across Texas, working ranches and breaking horses, always moving until he found something that felt like home. In turn, Grace found herself writing more than she had in years. She told him about her childhood in Del Rio, about her father who had been a freight hauler, honest and hardworking, until desperation had driven him to make one terrible choice. She told him about the day everything changed, though she could not bring herself to write the full details of her father's murder, and the moment her voice had disappeared. Harrison never pushed for more than she offered. The horses were changing too. Harrison worked with them individually now, building trust one animal at a time. He used a technique Grace had never seen before. He would spend hours just existing in the horse's space, mirroring their movements, reading their body language. When a horse would pin its ears or show teeth, Harrison would back off, giving it space. When it lowered its head or licked its lips, signs of relaxation, he would move closer. It was like watching a slow dance, each partner learning the other's rhythm. One afternoon, Grace was surprised to see Harrison riding the buckskin gelding bareback around the corral, nothing but a rope halter for guidance. The horse moved smoothly beneath him, responsive to the slightest shift of weight or pressure from Harrison's legs. There was no fight in the animal, no fear, just partnership. When Harrison dismounted and saw Grace watching, he led the gelding over to the fence. "Do you want to touch him?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then reached out slowly. The horse's neck was warm and solid beneath her palm, his coat soft despite the dust. He did not flinch from her touch. "His name is Sage," Harrison said, Because of his color and because sage is a healing plant. He was the most scared when I started. Now look at him." Harrison ran his hand down the horse's neck. He just needed someone to show him that not all humans are threats. Grace pulled out her journal. "How did you know which one to work with first?" "I did not, really. He chose me as much as I chose him. He was the first one who was willing to take a chance on trusting again." Grace looked into the horse's dark eyes and saw intelligence there, wariness but also curiosity. She understood that combination intimately. "Would you like to ride him?" Harrison asked suddenly. Grace drew back, shaking her head quickly. It had been 3 years since she had ridden, not since before her father's death. She was not sure she remembered how, was not sure she could trust herself not to freeze or panic. "Just think about it," Harrison said gently. "The offer stands whenever you are ready." But as she walked back to the saloon, Grace found that she was thinking about it. She was thinking about the freedom Harrison had described, the feeling of moving across open country with the wind in her face. She had given up so many things in the wake of her trauma. Her voice, her laughter, her joy. Maybe it was time to reclaim something. 2 days later, she came to the corral in the early morning wearing an old split riding skirt she had not touched in years. Harrison was already there, working with a roan mare, but when he saw Grace's outfit he smiled and turned his attention to Sage. "Good morning," he said. "I had a feeling you might come." Grace wrote, "Just a short ride, as short or as long as you want," Harrison assured her. He brought Sage to the fence and began saddling him with quick, efficient movements. "I will be right beside you the whole time." Her hands were shaking slightly as Harrison helped her mount. She had forgotten how high up a horse's back was, how powerful the animal felt beneath her. Sage shifted his weight and Grace gripped the saddle horn tightly. "Easy," Harrison said, and Grace was not sure if he was speaking to her or the horse. "Just breathe. Feel how he is standing steady beneath you. He is not going anywhere unless you ask him to." Grace forced herself to breathe slowly, deeply. Gradually her grip on the saddle horn loosened. Harrison mounted his own horse, the paint mare he called Juniper, and brought her alongside Sage. "We will just walk," he said. "Follow the fence line around the property. You set the pace." Grace nodded and gave the barest squeeze with her legs. Sage moved forward obediently, his gait smooth and steady. Harrison stayed right beside her, close enough that she could reach out and touch him if she needed to, but far enough to give her space. They walked the perimeter of the corrals, then out past the barn toward the open scrubland beyond. The morning was still cool, the sun just beginning to burn off the night's chill. The desert landscape stretched out in shades of gold and green and rust red, dotted with mesquite and creosote bushes. The Rio Grande was a silver ribbon in the distance, and beyond it, the hills of Mexico rose up purple against the horizon. Grace felt something in her chest expand, a feeling she had not experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it was called. Happiness. They rode for perhaps half an hour, never moving faster than a walk, but it was enough. When they returned to the barn, Grace dismounted with Harrison's steadying hand on her elbow. Her legs were shaky, but her eyes were bright. "Well?" Harrison asked. Grace smiled, really smiled for the first time in 3 years, and wrote. Again tomorrow. Harrison's answering smile was like the sun coming out. "Every morning if you want. We will go a little farther each time," and they did. Every morning before the saloon opened, Grace would meet Harrison at the barn, and they would ride out into the desert together. Sometimes they stayed close to town, following the river road or exploring the low hills. Other times they ventured farther, into the breaks and canyons where the landscape became more dramatic. Harrison taught her to read the land the way his grandmother had taught him, how to find water sources, which plants were edible, how to navigate by the stars. But more than that, he talked to her. He told her stories about the places he had been and the things he had seen. He shared his dreams of someday having his own ranch, a place where he could raise horses his way, with patience and respect. And he listened to her silences, reading her body language and her written words with the same attention he gave to his horses. "You know," he said one morning as they watered the horses at a desert spring, "I have noticed something about you. You may not speak, but you are far from silent. You communicate more with your gestures and your expressions than most people do with 1,000 words." Grace pulled out her journal, considering what to write. Finally, she wrote, "Sometimes I miss my voice, but sometimes I think losing it helped me see what was important. People do not listen to words very carefully, but they have to pay attention to everything else." "That is true wisdom," Harrison said. "Most people talk so much they never learn to truly listen, to themselves or to others." Grace wrote, "You listen." "I try," Harrison said. "It is what my grandmother taught me. She said that the Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and that the spaces between words are often where the truth lies." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the horses drink and the wind whisper through the grass. Then Harrison said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You do not have to answer if you do not want to." Grace nodded for him to continue. "You think you will ever speak again?" "Do you want to?" Grace thought about this for a long time before writing. "I do not know. At first I tried so hard, but nothing would come. After a while I stopped trying. Now I am not sure if I cannot speak or if I will not speak. Maybe there is no difference." Harrison read this carefully. "Maybe there is not," he agreed. "But either way, it does not change who you are. You are still Grace, voice or no voice." Something in Grace's heart twisted at these words. For 3 years, she had felt like less than a whole person, as if losing her voice had carved out some essential part of her. But Harrison looked at her as if she was complete, as if her silence was simply one facet of who she was rather than a defining limitation. She wrote quickly, "Thank you for seeing me, not just the broken parts." "You are not broken," Harrison said firmly. "You are changed, and there is a difference. Something broke inside you, yes, but what came after is not less than what was before. Just different." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, and she turned away to hide them, but Harrison reached out and gently turned her face back toward him. His calloused hand was warm against her cheek. "It is all right to cry," he said softly. "Tears are another way of speaking." And so Grace cried quietly, the tears running down her face while Harrison held her gaze with steady compassion. When the tears finally stopped, he handed her his bandana, and she wiped her face, embarrassed but also lighter somehow. "Better?" he asked. She nodded and wrote, "Much better. Good. Because I have been wanting to show you something, and I think today is the right day for it." He led her on horseback to a place she had never been before, a narrow canyon about an hour's ride from Del Rio. The canyon walls rose up red and gold on either side, carved by centuries of water into fantastic shapes. At the far end, hidden behind a tumble of boulders, was a small oasis, a clear pool fed by a spring, surrounded by cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. "I found this place my first week here," Harrison said as they dismounted. "I come here when I need to think, to get away from everything. I wanted to share it with you." Grace looked around in wonder. It was like something from a dream, this secret place of water and greenery in the harsh desert. Birds sang in the cottonwoods and dragonflies darted over the surface of the pool. She wrote, "It is beautiful. Thank you for bringing me here." "I thought maybe we could make this our place," Harrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Grace look up at him sharply. "Somewhere we can come when we need to escape the world for a while. Our place. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Grace felt her heart begin to pound. She looked at Harrison and saw in his gray-green eyes something she had not dared to name before. Affection, yes, but more than that. Longing. Hope. He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the way his pulse beat in his throat. "Grace," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I know I have only been in Del Rio for 2 months. I know we come from different places and have different scars, but I need you to know that these mornings with you have become the best part of my days. When I am with you, I feel like I can be completely myself. I do not have to pretend or hide anything. You see me clearly, and you do not look away." Grace's hands were shaking as she pulled out her journal. She wrote, "I feel the same, but I am scared." Scared of what? Of letting someone close, of being hurt again, of not being enough. Harrison read her words and shook his head. "You are more than enough, Grace Emmett. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. "I am scared too. I have never felt this way about anyone before. It is terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Grace squeezed his hand, feeling the strength and the gentleness in equal measure. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them, and looked up into his face. She could not tell him with words what she was feeling, but maybe she could show him in other ways. She reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingertips. Harrison's eyes widened slightly, but he held still, letting her explore. She traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his ear, the bridge of his nose. Her fingers came to rest on his lips, and she felt him tremble beneath her touch. "Grace," he whispered against her fingers. "May I kiss you?" She nodded, and Harrison cupped her face in both his hands, tilting her head up gently. When his lips met hers, it was soft and careful, a question rather than a demand. Grace felt something bloom inside her chest, something she had thought was dead, the possibility of joy. She kissed him back, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Harrison rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. Grace pulled back just enough to write, "Me too." They sat by the pool for hours that day, talking and kissing and simply being together. Harrison told her things he had never told anyone. His fear that he would never find a place to truly belong, his worry that his gentle approach to horses made him weak in the eyes of other men. Grace wrote about her nightmares, the way she sometimes woke in the night unable to breathe, trapped in the memory of the day her father died and her voice disappeared. "You are the strongest person I know," Harrison said when he read her words. "Do you understand that? You have survived something that would have destroyed most people. You have built a life for yourself despite everything. That is not weakness, Grace. That is extraordinary strength." Grace wanted to believe him. She was starting to believe him. As summer turned toward autumn, Grace and Harrison's relationship deepened. They were careful to be discreet around town, aware that gossip spread like wildfire in a place like Del Rio, but everyone who worked at the saloon knew there was something between the quiet bookkeeper and the horsebreaker. Colonel Walsh said nothing, but Grace caught him watching them with a small smile, as if he approved. Harrison had finished breaking all 20 Mustangs by late September, and Walsh made good on his promise to pay double. But when Walsh asked if Harrison planned to move on to the next job, Harrison hesitated. "I was thinking I might stay in Del Rio for a while longer," he said, "if there is work available." "There is always work for a man with your skills," Walsh said. "I could use someone to manage my horses permanently. The pay would be steady, and you could keep your room above the barn." Harrison accepted immediately, and Grace felt relief wash over her. She had been dreading the day he would pack his saddle bags and ride out of her life. Now she did not have to worry about that, at least not yet. But as autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, Grace became aware that their relationship could not remain in this pleasant limbo forever. They could not go on stealing kisses in the canyon and riding together at dawn without making some kind of decision about the future. And that meant confronting the question Grace had been avoiding. What kind of future could they have together? One evening in late October, as they sat by the spring watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, Harrison brought up the subject Grace had been dreading. "Grace," he said, taking her hand, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." She nodded, her heart beginning to race with anxiety. "I love you," Harrison said simply. "I am in love with you. I think I have been since the day you first brought me lunch at the corrals, but I know it for certain now. I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you see the world, the way you listen with your whole self. I love that you understand what it means to be patient, to work around fear rather than through it. I love everything about you." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. She pulled out her journal with shaking hands and wrote, "I love you too, so much it scares me." "I know you are scared," Harrison said. "I am too. Love is always a risk, but I think the risk is worth it. I think we are worth it." He paused, then continued, "I want to ask you something, but I need you to think about it seriously before you answer. I do not want you to feel pressured." Grace nodded, waiting. "Will you marry me?" Harrison asked. "I do not have much to offer you right now except a room above a barn and a string of horses. But I promise you I will spend every day working to build us a real home. I will be patient with you always. I will listen to your heart when you cannot speak with your voice. I will love you exactly as you are for the rest of my life." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. Marriage. She had not let herself think that far ahead, had not dared to imagine a future that complete. But now that Harrison had put the possibility into words, she realized it was what she wanted. Not someday, but now. She wanted to wake up beside him every morning. She wanted to build a life with him, whatever that looked like. She wrote quickly, her handwriting messier than usual. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." Harrison let out a breath she had not realized he was holding and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. "You have made me the happiest man in Texas," he murmured against her hair. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Del Rio Church, with Colonel Walsh standing as witness. Grace wore a simple white dress that Walsh's wife had helped her make, and Harrison wore his best shirt and a new pair of trousers. The priest who performed the ceremony had been briefed about Grace's silence, and he adjusted the vows accordingly, allowing her to nod her assent rather than speak it aloud. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt her heart might burst. They walked out of the church into the November sunshine, and the small crowd that had gathered threw rice and cheered. That night, in the room above the barn that was now their home, Harrison made love to her with the same patience and attention he brought to everything else. He learned her body the way he had learned the horses, reading every signal, responding to her needs before she even knew she had them. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Grace traced patterns on his chest while he stroked her hair. "I want to tell you something," Harrison said into the darkness. "About the day my father died." Grace propped herself up on one elbow, listening. "I was there when it happened. I was holding the horse's lead while my father worked on its hoof. The horse got spooked by a snake, and when it kicked out, I was too slow to pull my father out of the way. For years, I blamed myself. I thought if I had just been faster, more alert, he would still be alive." Grace reached out and took his hand, squeezing it. My grandmother finally made me understand that some things are not anyone's fault. They just are. Tragedy happens, and we can either let it destroy us or we can choose to survive it. She said that my father would not want me to carry guilt that did not belong to me. He would want me to live fully, to honor his memory by being the best man I could be. Grace understood what he was telling her, the parallel he was drawing to her own experience. She pulled her journal from the bedside table and wrote by the light of the oil lamp. I could not save my father either. When that man asked me where the gold was, I opened my mouth to lie to send him the wrong direction. But nothing came out. If I had been able to speak, maybe I could have given my father time to get away. Harrison sat up and took the journal from her, reading her words carefully. Then he set it aside and cupped her face in his hands, making her look at him. Listen to me, Grace. What happened to your father was not your fault. That man murdered him, not you. Your voice did not kill your father, and your silence does not dishonor him. You survived. That is what matters. You survived, and you built a new life, and now you are here with me. Do you think your father would want you to carry guilt and shame? Or do you think he would want you to be happy? Grace felt something break loose inside her, some tight knot of guilt she had been carrying for 3 years. She buried her face in Harrison's shoulder and sobbed, great wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Harrison held her through it all, rocking her gently and murmuring words of comfort. When the storm of tears finally passed, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. She wrote, "Thank you. I think I needed to hear that." "I will remind you as many times as you need," Harrison promised. "That is what marriage means. We carry each other's burdens. We remind each other of the truth when the lies get too loud." Grace kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture, and they made love again, slower this time, savoring every moment. Over the following months, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Grace continued to keep the books for the saloon, and Harrison managed Colonel Walsh's growing string of horses. They saved every penny they could, working toward Harrison's dream of buying their own land. In the evenings, they would sit together in their small room, Grace reading aloud from books in her mind while Harrison whittled small wooden figures. He had a talent for carving, and he made her gifts. A tiny horse, a bird in flight, a woman with her face turned toward the sun. "That is you," he said when he gave her the woman figure. "The way you look in the mornings when we ride out and the sun first touches your face, like you are drinking in the light." Grace treasured each carving, keeping them on a shelf above their bed. In the spring of 1877, tragedy struck Del Rio in the form of a cholera outbreak. The disease swept through the town like wildfire, killing dozens of people in a matter of weeks. The saloon closed temporarily, and everyone who could help was pressed into service caring for the sick. Grace worked alongside the town doctor, bringing water and broth to patients, washing soiled linens, doing whatever she could to ease suffering. Harrison worked equally hard, using his horse skills to make fast trips to San Antonio for medicine and supplies. One night he came home to find Grace sitting on the edge of their bed, her face pale with exhaustion and something else, fear. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, kneeling before her. Grace wrote with shaking hands, "I think I am pregnant." Harrison went very still. Then a smile spread slowly across his face, transforming him. "You are sure?" She nodded. "I have missed my monthly time twice now, and I have been sick in the mornings." "A baby," Harrison whispered. He placed his hand gently on her still flat belly. "Our baby." Grace wrote, "Are you happy?" "I know we wanted to wait until we had our own land." "I am overjoyed," Harrison said firmly. "Yes, it is sooner than we planned, but that does not matter. We will make it work. We always do." He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "You are going to be such a wonderful mother, Grace." She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her. How could she be a good mother when she could not speak? How would she soothe a crying baby, sing lullabies, tell bedtime stories? She wrote her fears quickly, and Harrison read them with a furrowed brow. "Grace," he said when he finished reading, "you are going to be wonderful because you love this child already. I can see it in your eyes. Yes, you will parent differently than other mothers. But that does not mean you will parent worse. You will find your own ways to communicate with our baby. Children are remarkably good at understanding what matters, and what matters is love. Everything else is just details." Grace wanted to believe him. She tried to believe him. The cholera epidemic ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the town shaken but recovering. Grace and Harrison had been fortunate. Neither of them had fallen ill. As summer came on and Grace's pregnancy became visible, she found that Harrison had been right about one thing. She loved this growing life inside her with a fierceness that surprised her. She would place her hand on her belly and feel the baby move, and something primal and powerful would surge through her. This child was hers to protect, hers to nurture. In July, Colonel Walsh called Harrison into his office for a private conversation. When Harrison emerged, he looked stunned. He found Grace in the saloon's back room and pulled her outside into the hot afternoon. "Walsh is selling the saloon," Harrison said without preamble. "He and his wife are moving to San Antonio to be closer to their daughter. He wants to know if we want to buy it." Grace stared at him in shock. She wrote, "We cannot afford to buy the saloon." "He is not asking full price," Harrison explained. "He said he owes you a debt for staying with him after your father died, for keeping his business running smoothly all these years. He said you are like the daughter he never had. He wants to sell it to us for half of what it is worth, and he will hold the mortgage himself. We would pay him back over time." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. Colonel Walsh had been so kind to her over the years, but she had never expected anything like this. She wrote, "But we do not know anything about running a saloon." "You already run it," Harrison pointed out. "You keep the books, manage the inventory, make sure everything operates smoothly. Walsh just owns it and makes the big decisions. We can do that together. And think about what it would mean, Grace. A business of our own, a real home, security for our child." Grace thought about it. Harrison was right. She did know how to run the saloon. And owning it would mean they would never have to worry about being turned out if Walsh decided to sell to someone else. It would mean a future for their family. She wrote, "All right. Let us do it." Harrison whooped and picked her up, spinning her around despite her pregnant belly. "We are going to own a saloon. Grace Emmett Xerxes, saloon owner." The transaction was completed by the end of August, just weeks before Grace's baby was due. They renamed the establishment the Sage and Juniper Saloon, after Harrison's first 2 horses, and made small changes to put their own stamp on the place. Harrison built a nursery in the apartment above the saloon where they now lived, painting it yellow like sunshine. Grace went into labor on a cool September evening, and Harrison stayed by her side through the long night that followed, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. The midwife praised Grace for being so quiet during labor, not realizing that silence was Grace's only option. When the sun rose and the baby finally came, a lusty, red-faced boy with a shock of dark hair, Grace held him to her chest and wept. "He is perfect," Harrison whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel after Harrison's father. Samuel Xerxes, born September 18, 1877 in Del Rio, Texas. Grace discovered quickly that Harrison had been right about her fears. Samuel did not need her to speak to understand her. He learned to read her expressions, to respond to her touch, to recognize the difference between her happy smile and her worried frown. When he cried, she would hold him close and hum, a sound she could make even if she could not form words. The vibration of the humming soothed him just as effectively as any lullaby. As Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler, Grace taught him sign language, creating their own system of communication. Harrison learned it too, and soon all three of them were conversing in a mixture of signs, writing, and spoken words. It was not traditional, but it worked for them. The saloon prospered under their ownership. Harrison's reputation as a horse breaker brought ranchers from all over South Texas to Del Rio, and they inevitably ended up at the Sage and Juniper for drinks and lodging. Grace's careful management kept costs low and profits steady. Within 3 years, they had paid off Colonel Walsh's mortgage and owned the business free and clear. In 1880, Grace became pregnant again. This time she was less anxious, confident in her ability to mother. Their second child was a daughter, born in April with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark hair. They named her Sarah, and she was even quieter than Samuel had been as a baby, as if she understood that noise was not necessary in their household. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Samuel started school when he turned 6, and though other children sometimes teased him about his mother's silence, he learned to defend her fiercely. "My ma does not need to talk to be the best ma in Texas," he told one bully, and punched the boy in the nose for good measure. Harrison had to have a stern talk with him about violence, but Grace could tell her husband was proud. One evening in the spring of 1883, after the children were asleep, and the saloon had closed for the night, Harrison and Grace sat together on the balcony of their apartment, looking out over the quiet street. Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her automatically. "Do you ever regret it?" Harrison asked softly. "Marrying me, I mean. Staying in Del Rio instead of going somewhere else, starting fresh where no one knew about your father or your silence." Grace pulled back to look at him, surprised. She pulled out the journal she still kept in her pocket and wrote, "Never, not once. You gave me back my life." "You gave me mine," Harrison said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from job to job with no real purpose. You made me want to put down roots to build something lasting. You and the children are everything to me." Grace wrote, "I love you more now than I did when we married. I did not know that was possible. It keeps growing, does not it?" Harrison said wonderingly. "Every day I think I cannot possibly love you more, and then you do something or look at me a certain way, and my heart just expands again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of the Rio Grande in the distance and the cicadas singing their summer song. Then Harrison said, "I have been thinking about something. What would you say to buying some land outside of town? Maybe 100 acres or so, somewhere we could build a house and raise horses properly. The children are getting bigger, and they need room to run. And I think it would be good for us to have a place that is truly ours, away from the noise and bustle of the saloon." Grace considered this. The saloon had been good to them, but she too had dreamed of having a proper home, a place with a garden and room for the children to play. She wrote, "I think that is a wonderful idea, but what would we do with the saloon?" "We could hire a manager to run it," Harrison suggested. "Keep ownership, but let someone else handle the day-to-day operations. The income would still be steady, but we would not be tied to the place." Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, let us do it." Over the next year they searched for the right piece of land. They finally found it in the summer of 1884. A beautiful spread of rolling hills and grassland about 5 miles outside Del Rio, with a spring-fed creek running through it. The land had been owned by an elderly rancher who had died without heirs, and his estate was selling it cheaply just to be done with it. They bought the land and spent months designing and building their house. Harrison did much of the work himself, with help from Samuel, who at 7 years old was already eager to learn carpentry and building. The house was not large, but it was solid and well made, with big windows that let in the light and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings. They moved to the ranch in the spring of 1885, and Grace felt as if she was finally coming home. She planted a garden, filling it with vegetables and flowers. Harrison built corrals and a barn, and began breeding horses in earnest, using his gentle methods to produce animals that were prized across Texas for their calm temperament and intelligence. The children thrived in the open country. Samuel became his father's shadow, learning everything Harrison could teach him about horses and ranching. Sarah was quieter, more introspective, and she stayed close to Grace, learning to cook and garden and keep house. But she also inherited her father's way with animals, and by the time she was 6 she could gentle a nervous horse as well as Harrison could. One evening in the fall of 1886, as Grace was putting Sarah to bed, her daughter looked up at her with serious eyes and asked, "Mama, why do you not talk?" Grace sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her journal. She had been preparing for this question for years, knowing it would come eventually. She wrote, "Something very sad happened to me when I was young, and it made my voice go away. But I can still talk to you in other ways, cannot I?" Sarah nodded. "I like the way you talk," she said. "It is special. None of my friends' mamas talk like you do." Grace felt her heart swell. She wrote, "I like the way I talk too now. It took me a long time to feel that way, but your papa helped me understand that I do not need a voice to be heard." "Papa is smart," Sarah agreed. She yawned hugely. "I love you, Mama." Grace kissed her daughter's forehead and signed "I love you too," a gesture Sarah understood perfectly when she came downstairs. Harrison was waiting for her in their bedroom. "Sarah asked about my voice," Grace wrote, showing him her journal. "What did you tell her?" Grace showed him what she had written, and Harrison read it with a soft smile. "That is perfect," he said. "You have never lied to the children about it, but you have never burdened them with the full weight of the trauma either. That is good parenting." Grace set the journal aside and came to sit beside him on the bed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he automatically put his arm around her. "I have been thinking about something," Harrison said after a moment. "About the man who killed your father. Whatever happened to him?" Grace stiffened. She had not thought about that man in years, had deliberately pushed the memory as far from her mind as possible. She picked up the journal again and wrote, "I do not know. He disappeared after the murder. The sheriff never caught him." "Do you ever worry he will come back?" Grace considered this honestly. She wrote, "No, I think if he was going to come back, he would have done it years ago. And even if he did, I am not that terrified girl anymore. I have you and the children. I have a life worth protecting. I would not let him take it from me." "That is my fierce Grace," Harrison said with pride in his voice. He kissed the top of her head. "I will protect you and the children with my life." "You know that, right?" Grace nodded. She had never doubted it. The years rolled on, marked by small joys and occasional sorrows. Colonel Walsh died in 1888, and they made the trip to San Antonio for his funeral, grateful to pay their respects to the man who had changed their lives. The saloon they had bought from him continued to prosper under their hired manager, providing steady income that allowed them to expand the ranch. In 1889, Grace became pregnant for the 3rd time, much to her surprise. She was 33 years old, and she had thought her childbearing years were behind her. But in the spring of 1890, she gave birth to another son, whom they named Henry after Harrison's middle name. Samuel was 13 and Sarah was 10. and they both doted on their baby brother with the enthusiasm of children old enough to appreciate a baby without having to do all the work of caring for one. Henry was a happy, easygoing child who smiled at everything and everyone. As he grew, it became clear that he had inherited his mother's intuitive understanding of nonverbal communication. He learned to read expressions and body language with uncanny accuracy, and he rarely needed words to understand what people were feeling. One day when Henry was about 4 years old, he climbed into Grace's lap as she sat in her rocking chair on the porch. He looked up at her with his father's gray-green eyes and said, "Mama, I do not mind that you do not talk. I can hear you anyway." Grace hugged him tightly, blinking back tears. Out of all her children, Henry understood most deeply what it meant to communicate beyond words. In 1895, when Samuel was 18, he announced that he wanted to go to Austin to study veterinary medicine. "I want to be able to help animals the way Pa does," he explained. "But I want to understand the science behind it too." Harrison and Grace were both proud and sad to see him go, but they knew it was right. Samuel had always been curious about how things worked, always asking questions and seeking deeper understanding. Veterinary medicine would be a perfect fit for him. Sarah, at 15, had no interest in leaving the ranch. She had her father's gift with horses and had already earned a reputation in the area as someone who could gentle even the most difficult animal. Local ranchers sought her out, and she earned her own money training their horses. Henry, at 5, was still too young to know what he wanted, but he showed signs of being a natural storyteller. He would make up elaborate tales to entertain his sister, acting out all the parts with dramatic flair. Grace wondered if he might become a writer or an actor someday. One evening in the summer of 1896, as Grace and Harrison sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Harrison said, "We have had a good life, have not we?" Grace nodded and wrote, "Better than I ever dreamed possible. When I lost my voice, I thought I had lost everything, but I found so much more. I found you." "And I found you," Harrison said. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You know what I realized the other day? It has been 20 years since we met. 20 years since you brought me lunch at the corrals, and I knew, somehow, that you were going to change my life." Grace wrote, "Did you really know then?" "Maybe not consciously," Harrison admitted, "but something in me recognized something in you. A kindred spirit, I suppose. Someone else who understood what it meant to be different, to see the world in a way others did not." Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had been her anchor for 2 decades. She wrote, "I am so grateful for you. For this life, for everything we have built together. It has been an honor and a privilege to build it with you," Harrison said. "And we are not done yet. We have years ahead of us still, God willing." And they did have years, good years filled with the ordinary joys and sorrows of life. Samuel finished his veterinary training and returned to Del Rio, opening a practice that quickly became essential to every rancher in South Texas. Sarah married a kind young man named Thomas who worked for the railroad, and they built a house on the edge of the ranch property, so Sarah could stay close to the horses she loved. They had 3 children in quick succession, and Grace delighted in being a grandmother. Henry grew into a thoughtful young man who did indeed become a writer, publishing his first collection of short stories when he was only 21. His stories often featured characters who communicated in unconventional ways, and Grace recognized herself in many of them, though Henry always changed enough details to protect her privacy. In 1905, Harrison and Grace celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party, and as Grace looked around at the faces of the people she loved, she felt overwhelming gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it had all come from the ashes of her greatest tragedy. That night, after everyone had gone home and it was just the two of them again, Harrison gave her a gift. A wooden carving of a woman on horseback, her face turned toward the rising sun. It was exquisitely detailed, every curve of the horse's muscles visible, the woman's hair streaming behind her. "This is you," Harrison said. "The way I see you, free and strong and beautiful." Grace held the carving carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. She set it down gently and pulled out her journal, which she still carried everywhere despite having other means of communication available to her. Some habits were too ingrained to break. She wrote, "You have spent 30 years telling me I am not broken, teaching me to hear my own voice, even in silence, loving me exactly as I am. I do not have words big enough to tell you what that means to me." "You do not need big words," Harrison said, pulling her into his arms. "I can hear your heart just fine." And that, Grace thought as she melted into her husband's embrace, was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. He had always listened to her heart from that very first day. He had heard the things she could not say, understood the depths she could not articulate. He had loved her not despite her silence but including it, as one facet of the complex woman she was. They stood together on the porch of the house they had built, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The cicadas sang their evening song, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. The air smelled of mesquite and creosote and the particular sweetness of the desert after a rain. "You ever think about that day at the canyon?" Harrison asked suddenly. "When I first told you I loved you and asked you to marry me," Grace nodded. "I was so nervous," Harrison admitted with a laugh. "I thought you might say no. I thought maybe I was asking too much too soon." Grace wrote, "I was terrified, but I also knew it was right. I think I had been waiting for you my whole life, even before I knew you existed." "That is how I felt too," Harrison said. "Like I had been incomplete, and then suddenly I was whole." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes after decades of shared life. Then Harrison said, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens, however many years we have left, I am grateful for every single day. You have made my life richer and fuller than I ever imagined possible. You and our children and this ranch and everything we have built together, it is all more than I ever dreamed of having." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She wrote, "I feel the same. I love you with everything I am." "And I love you," Harrison said, kissing her softly. "I will love you until my last breath, and if there is anything after, I will love you there too." As the years continued to pass, Grace found that her silence had become simply a part of who she was, no more defining than the color of her eyes or the texture of her hair. She communicated fluently through her journals, through sign language, through the subtle language of expression and gesture that her family all understood. She was not limited by her lack of voice because she had found so many other ways to speak. When people asked her children how they managed with a mother who could not talk, they looked puzzled by the question. "She talks to us all the time," Sarah would say, "just not with words." In the spring of 1910, Grace and Harrison made a trip back to the canyon where Harrison had first told her he loved her 34 years earlier. The place had not changed much. The red walls still rose up around the hidden pool, the cottonwoods still whispered in the breeze. They sat by the water's edge, holding hands and remembering. "I asked you here if you thought you would ever speak again," Harrison said. "Do you remember what you wrote?" Grace nodded. She remembered every word of that conversation, every moment of that transformative day. "Have you ever regretted not trying harder to get your voice back?" Harrison asked gently. Grace thought about this carefully before writing. No. At first I wanted it back desperately, but over time I realized that my silence had taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. It taught me patience. It taught me to listen deeply, not just to others but to myself. It taught me that there are many ways to communicate and words are just one of them. If I could go back and change what happened, would I? Yes, because I would save my father, but the silence itself. I have made peace with it. It is part of who I am now. Harrison read her words and nodded slowly. You have always been wiser than me, he said. It took me years to understand what you just wrote, and you lived it every day. Grace smiled and wrote, We learned from each other. That is what love is. Yes, Harrison agreed. That is exactly what love is. They spent the afternoon at the canyon, talking about everything and nothing, remembering the life they had built together. As the sun began to set and they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Harrison helped Grace mount her horse, his hand steadying her as they had 1,000 times before. Ready? He asked. Grace nodded and urged her horse forward. They rode side by side through the desert. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. The years that followed were gentle ones. Grace and Harrison grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their movements slowing but their love never diminishing. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices and laughter. Samuel's veterinary practice became one of the most respected in Texas, and he trained apprentices who carried his gentle methods across the state and beyond. Sarah and Thomas's children all inherited the family gift with horses, and they expanded the ranch's breeding operation, producing animals that were sought after across the country. Henry's writing career flourished, and he published novels that were read and loved by people who had never set foot in Texas, but who recognized universal truths in his stories of the Wild West. In the summer of 1920, Grace and Harrison celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp-minded and devoted to each other. The family gathered once again at the ranch, 3 generations coming together to honor the couple who had started it all. As Grace looked around at the sea of faces, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, she was overwhelmed by the realization of what she and Harrison had created. This family, with all its love and complexity and connection, had grown from a single choice, her decision to trust a quiet cowboy who said he would listen to her heart. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room they had shared for so many years, Harrison moved more slowly than usual. Grace noticed and wrote, "Are you all right? Just tired," Harrison said with a smile. It was a big day, but Grace saw something in his eyes that worried her, a shadow that had not been there before. She made him promise to see Samuel in the morning, and Harrison agreed easily, which worried her even more. Her husband never agreed to see a doctor without argument. Samuel came to the ranch the next day and examined his father thoroughly. When he emerged from the bedroom, his face was grave. He sat Grace down and explained gently that Harrison's heart was failing. There was nothing to be done except make him comfortable and wait for the inevitable. "How long?" Grace wrote, her hands shaking. "Weeks," Samuel said quietly. "Maybe a month or 2 if we are lucky." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her. Harrison was her foundation, the bedrock of her existence. She could not imagine a world without him in it. Over the following weeks, she stayed by his side constantly. The children and grandchildren came and went, paying their respects, saying their goodbyes. Harrison held court from his bed, telling stories and dispensing wisdom, making sure everyone knew how proud he was of them and how much he loved them. One evening, when it was just the 2 of them, Harrison took Grace's hand and said, "I need you to promise me something." Grace nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "Promise me you will keep living after I am gone. Really living, not just existing. Promise me you will still ride out to watch the sunrise, still work in your garden, still spend time with our family. Promise me you will remember that you are not half of a whole, you are complete in yourself. I have been lucky enough to share my life with you, but your life does not end when mine does." Grace wrote through her tears, "How can I live without you? You are everything to me." "No," Harrison said firmly. "I am not everything. I am part of your life, a big part, but you were whole before you met me, and you will be whole after I am gone. You are Grace Emmett Xerxes, one of the strongest, wisest, most loving women I have ever known. You have survived things that would have destroyed lesser people. You will survive this too." Grace shook her head, but Harrison squeezed her hand. "Listen to me," he said, his voice growing weaker. "I have had the most extraordinary life because you were in it. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You taught me what love really means. I am so grateful for every moment we have had together. But now I need you to let me go when the time comes. I need you to live on and carry our love with you. Can you do that for me?" Grace could barely see through her tears, but she nodded. She would try. For him, she would try. Harrison died 3 weeks later on a clear October morning with Grace holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you." Grace felt something break inside her when he took his last breath, but she also felt something else: gratitude. Gratitude for 45 years of love and partnership, for the family they had built, for every sunrise they had watched together, and every evening they had spent on the porch. She had been blessed beyond measure, and even though the pain of loss was almost unbearable, she would not trade a single moment of their time together. The funeral was held at the ranch, and it seemed like half of South Texas turned out to pay their respects. Harrison had touched so many lives with his gentle way of training horses and his steady kindness. People shared stories of his generosity, his wisdom, his unwavering integrity. Grace listened to it all and felt proud. This was the man she had loved, the man who had changed her life. In the weeks after Harrison's death, Grace struggled to find her footing. The house felt empty without him, the days stretched out long and lonely. But she remembered her promise, and she forced herself to keep living. She rode out to watch the sunrise, though it hurt to ride alone. She worked in her garden, though her hands shook and tears fell on the soil. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, though every family gathering reminded her of the absence at the center of it all. Slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Not to forget, never to forget, but to carry her grief in a way that allowed her to also carry joy. She found comfort in the small things: the smell of coffee in the morning, the feel of the sun on her face, the sound of her great-grandchildren playing in the yard. She found purpose in maintaining the ranch and the breeding program Harrison had started, in supporting Sarah and her children as they took over the day-to-day operations. One morning about 6 months after Harrison's death, Grace rode out to the canyon for the first time since he had died. She half expected the place to feel empty without him, but instead it felt full of his presence. She could almost hear his voice on the wind, could almost feel his hand in hers. She sat by the pool and pulled out her journal, writing a letter to him, though she knew he would never read it. "My dearest Harrison," she wrote, "you told me I would survive your death, and you were right. I am surviving. Some days that is all I am doing, but other days I find moments of genuine happiness. I think you would be proud of how I am carrying on. I am trying to live the way you would want me to, with gratitude and grace. I miss you every moment of every day, but I am also grateful for the life we built together. You taught me so much about love and patience and seeing beyond the surface of things. You taught me that silence does not mean absence, that there are 1,000 ways to communicate if we are willing to listen. You taught me that broken things can be mended, not back to what they were, but into something new and equally valuable. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for listening to my heart when I had no voice. Thank you for 45 years of the most extraordinary love I could have imagined. I will carry you with me always, until we meet again. Your Grace. She closed the journal and sat for a long time, listening to the water and the wind. Then she mounted her horse and rode back to the ranch, ready to face whatever came next. Grace lived for another 12 years after Harrison's death, staying active and engaged with her family until the very end. She was there when Henry won a prestigious literary award for his novel about a silent woman in the Old West. She was there when Sarah's daughter became the first woman to win the prestigious Texas Horseman's Award. She was there for births and weddings and all the ordinary moments that made up a life. She died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1932, at the age of 76. Her children found her in her bed, a smile on her face, Harrison's wooden carving of the woman on horseback clutched in her hand. They buried her beside Harrison on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstone read simply, Grace Emmett Xerxes, 1856-1932. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, she spoke with her heart and those who listened were blessed. At the funeral, Henry stood to give the eulogy. He spoke of his mother's strength and resilience, her capacity for love, her quiet wisdom. And then he said something that made everyone nod in recognition. My mother lost her voice when she was 17 years old, Henry said. But she was never silent. She communicated more with her gestures, her expressions, her written words than most people do with a lifetime of speech. She taught all of us that there are many ways to be heard, many ways to connect with others. And she taught us, through the example of her marriage to our father, what real love looks like. It looks like patience. It looks like seeing the whole person, not just the easy parts. It looks like listening, truly listening to what is being said beneath the words or in the absence of them. He paused and looked out at the gathered crowd, 3 generations of the family Grace and Harrison had created. My father used to say that when they first met, he told my mother he would listen to her heart, and he did, for 45 years. He heard everything she could not say out loud, and he loved her not despite her silence but including it. That is the legacy they leave us, the knowledge that love is not about perfection or ease. It is about seeing each other clearly, accepting what we find there and choosing to stand together anyway. It is about listening, really listening to the people we love. As the mourners filed past the grave, dropping flowers and saying their farewells, a young great-granddaughter named Emma stopped and looked at Grace's headstone with curious eyes. "Why does it say she spoke with her heart?" she asked her mother. Sarah's daughter smiled and knelt beside Emma. "Because your great-grandmother could not speak with words," she explained. "But she could still talk to people, through writing and signs and the way she looked at you. And your great-grandfather, he was very good at listening to all those other ways of talking. He used to say he could hear her heart, that he could understand what she felt even when she could not tell him with words." "That is beautiful," Emma said softly. "Yes," her mother agreed, "it is. And it is also true, love is not just about what we say. It is about how we listen, how we see each other, how we choose to understand." Emma placed her flower on the grave and stepped back. As the family walked down the hill toward the ranch house where the reception was being held, the wind picked up, rustling through the grass and carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers. And if you listened very carefully, with more than just your ears, You might have heard something in that wind. The sound of two hearts that had learned to speak to each other beyond words, now reunited at last in whatever came after this life. The ranch continued for generations, each one telling the story of Harrison and Grace, the cowboy and the silent woman who had found each other in the wild lands of South Texas and built something that endured. The breeding program they started produced horses for over a century, animals known for their intelligence and gentle temperament. The canyon where Harrison had first declared his love became a family landmark, a place where young couples would go when they wanted to make important decisions or simply find peace. And always, always, the story was told. She traded her voice for silence years ago, traumatized into muteness by witnessing her father's murder. And the cowboy said, "Then I will listen to your heart." And he did. He listened, and he loved. And together they proved that the truest communication happens not through words but through the willingness to truly see and be seen by another person. Their love story became legendary in Del Rio, passed down through the generations as a reminder that love can heal the deepest wounds, that patience can overcome the greatest obstacles, and that sometimes the most important things we have to say are the ones we never speak aloud.